what we really need to do and what we're really trying to do with our work is bring back that more old forest condition. And the main ingredient for that is just time. That's what we're doing, is we're buying these forests time.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with Shelby Perry from the Northeast Wilderness Trust, which is buying up and restoring really, from a British perspective, really huge swathes of land in America's wild Northeast. I read recently that America's eastern seaboard is considered one of the greatest inadvertent rewilding success stories in modern history. Forest cover, we're going to talk about this, I presume, Shelby, but forest cover went from somewhere in the 20s of percent to somewhere in the 70s of percent in the space of about 100 years. So it's been an incredible story, and we know all over the world of these great forests and the images we see of kind of the reds and the ambers and the incredible colors of the autumn in New England and so on. So I was just very excited to talk to you, Shelby, and to hear about your work as a Director of Wildland at the Trust. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
So maybe we can start there. My history of American ecology is kind of patchy, but my understanding is broadly that European settlers arrived and cleared all the forests in order to make farmland. And then better farmland was discovered sort of late 19th century, early 20th century in the center of America, in the Midwest and so on, after the Native American people were subjugated or driven out. And so those early settlers and those farmers then moved and the land was abandoned. And so there was a huge kind of vegetation pulse and the forest grew back very rapidly. Is that roughly the story of the forests of the eastern half of America?
Yeah, I mean, that's roughly it. When the settlers arrived and cleared the land for farming and also just forest products, there's a huge mills and logging camps, and they did big log drives down the rivers. So the ecology was really, really altered really, really quickly. You know, forests were leveled and they pulled all the obstacles out of rivers to float the logs down to the mills to process. And then farming moved in, mostly in southern New England. Most of southern New England was sort of sheep and cow farming. And then northern New England was more, I mean, there was plenty of that, but there's also more woodlands and sort of timber harvesting. And then, yeah, with westward expansion, much of it was abandoned. And so when you walk through the woods here, there are old stone walls and the sort of holes of the cellars of buildings. Sometimes you find entire towns, the cellar holes of entire towns that are just now forest land. We actually have one in a Northeast Wilderness Trust preserve. There's a town in there that I dug into the history of because I was curious of how it went from being a town to being a big block of forest land again. And so, yeah, the forest recovered on its own over about 100 years. And, there's been sort of continued forest management and activity in there. But by and large, it's been a really big recovery story for rewilding, passive rewilding, just sort of, millions of acres just came back to forest.
And we're talking kind of Quebec, sort of eastern Canada, all the way down to, I guess, Okefenokee, kind of southern Georgia. That's kind of the extent of it, right? Tens of millions of acres. Yeah,
all of that area was settled. Much of it was abandoned. Obviously, many people remained here as well. And so that rewilding story really covers the entire area. My focus area at Northeast Wilderness Trust is really sort of New England and New York State. So we're focused just sort of on that northeastern United States region as an organization. But the rewilding story is much bigger.
And how well do we understand what that environment may have been like at the time of the arrival of European settlers? We think of it now as extensive closed canopy forest. Do you think that's how it always was? Because over here in Britain and northwestern Europe, there's been a very interesting shift in our perception of how our environment may have been. The historic view was we were like Brazil. It was forested. There's that story that a red squirrel could have crossed from the northern tip of John O'Groats all the way down to Land's End in Cornwall without touching the ground. And then the work of the likes of Professor Frans Vera at the University of Utrecht and others led us to believe that, in fact, it would have been much more of a mosaic of habitats, kind of semi-open woodland pastures, landscapes shaped by the activities of large herbivores. European bison is basically a woodland animal, and various kinds of deer and the rootling of wild boar and all these things, wild horses, would have kept the landscape dynamic and would have kept much of the landscape semi-open. And so what do we think about the historic ecosystem of Eastern America? Do you think it was closed canopy forest, as you might find in, say, Central America? Or were the bison that far east? Or were there large grazing elk? What impact would those grazing and browsing animals have had? Beavers clearing valley bottoms and things. I'm interested in this idea of closed canopy versus semi-open or open landscape.
Yeah, I mean, it was a shifting mosaic for sure. There were open areas from beavers are the big ones, but also natural disturbance. Every once in a while, hurricanes come up here and just level big areas of forest, and then you have recovery from that. A lot of work has been done. Obviously, when Europeans arrived, they were not the first humans here. And so there were indigenous areas of land clearing and areas of settlement and some forms of forest management that went on for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Work that I've read specifically for the state of Vermont says that probably about 7 to 8% was in sort of a young forest transitioning position, and then maybe 80% of the landscape was closed canopy forest. And then there was, of course, areas of open wetlands and water and things like that.
I'd like to talk a little bit about beavers, because I heard from, when I was in Maine on holiday a few years ago, someone told me that a lot of the valley bottoms were comprised of these lovely sort of eye-shaped meadows, and they described the origin of those meadows having been beavers who created their ribbon wetlands along the bottom of the valley. They opened up the valley to sunlight, and over time their dams got sedimented up, and eventually the beavers were forced to move on for that reason, and you'd be left with these lovely fertile, flat, open meadows at the bottom of the valleys, which then the Native Americans would have cultivated for crops. And it was described to me that this was a very common pattern throughout New England, that while there may not have been large bovines cracking open the forest and creating these meadows, the beavers certainly were.
Yeah, there were lots of large grazing animals. There were caribou, elk, and white-tailed deer that moved through the area, but they were all really forest species. So they weren't really like cracking open the forest. But the beavers certainly were. Valley bottoms have chains of beaver ponds, and you can see them on the maps today. They're readily identifiable because they have the sort of line of the dam, and then the wetland stretches back behind it, and usually there's a string of them. Beavers live in family groups, and they raise their young with them for 2 to 4 years to train them to do all the things that beavers need to do, and then their young will disperse upstream or downstream, and so you end up with these big, long chains of them. And a lot of times they move on either because it sediments up and it's hard to maintain a pond there, or because they run out of their sort of preferred food sources. So you can also see them often in aerial photography because they're ringed with conifer trees, because they don't like to eat the needle-leaf trees as much as they like the broadleaf trees. So once they've sort of eaten all their preferred food, they'll often move upstream or downstream and start another one. And then the downstream pond, or the pond they abandon, will sediment in and convert to meadow. And those meadows stay open for a really long time. And ecologically, we don't totally understand why. I read one theory years ago that it had to do with the difference between the voles that live in the forest and the voles that live in the meadow, that the meadow voles will furiously defend their territory and eat all of the tree seedlings and seeds and not allow other forest voles to come in, and it stays a meadow. But that's just a theory. We don't actually know why they, because if we just cleared a patch of woods, if we just cut down all the trees and we let it go here, it'll be forest again within a couple years. I mean, the trees come back very quickly. It'll be young forest. It won't be the same forest, but it will come back with trees very fast. But beaver meadows stay open for a really long time. So they remain obvious on the landscape, and you could see those meadows. And usually there's sort of a string of them where it makes the full transition from meadow to sort of swamp to pond, and sometimes several times in a row.
And do we know where the bison frontier was when bison were still abundant, before they were annihilated by European hunters in the late 19th century, because there are wood bison in Canada that live kind of certainly at the edges of the boreal forests. Do we know for sure that there weren't bison impacting those forests, at least on the western side?
So the American bison is a plains species, lives sort of in the southern and western plains. They came very far east. They came as far as Kentucky, I know. I'm not quite sure how far north they came. I guess they do go up pretty far into Canada in some places. So probably there were some of them up here. I don't think they were a very large impact on the landscape. I think the predominant herbivore in this region in the forests prior to European arrival was mostly elk. There were huge herds of elk, and those are more or less extirpated now. There is a herd in Pennsylvania, I believe, but they don't come up to sort of New England anymore.
So what happened was that the trees were cut and the timber was floated down the river. The land was converted to farmland. And of course, the wildlife was more or less extirpated. I mean, buckskin was a currency with which Europeans traded with the Native Americans, the buckskin being, of course, the skin of the white-tailed deer. And my understanding is that by kind of 1920s, there was really not much of the wildlife left at all. But then when the trees recovered during the subsequent 100 years to today, you had a dramatic rebound in those species that did remain. So which species can we kind of celebrate having returned to their former abundance in the forests of New England?
Well, many species were extirpated, and several were actively reintroduced by people, mostly in the early 20th century. So beavers were fully extirpated from the Northeast and made a recovery after reintroduction. Moose is another large herbivore that we have, forest-dwelling herbivore. The moose they weren't completely extirpated from New England, but they were sort of relegated to the very rural areas of northern Maine. And they recovered on their own. They came back sort of slowly as the forest rebounded, and they are now doing fairly well across their range, although there are some new stressors. Fishers were completely extirpated. Those large weasels, they were reintroduced actually by foresters to control porcupines, because porcupines were eating the forest. And now they've made a pretty complete recovery. White-tailed deer were pretty much extirpated, and they're back. Black bears I'm not sure if they were ever fully extirpated, but they are definitely back and doing well now.
And which species were extirpated and haven't made it back? I mean, for example, I know the apex predators would be, I guess, the wolves and the cougars, or catamounts as they were known in New England. And I've heard that the wolf is making a tentative comeback from the northeast, from the Canadian side of the border, but the catamount, despite the odd sighting of a dispersing male that somehow managed to cross the Midwest, is absent. I did a dinner with some others in New York City in November last year for Mighty Earth, which is a campaign group in Washington, D.C. that's building a coalition of groups with the goal of reintroducing cougars to the Northeast, principally to control white deer and to restore equilibrium to the ecosystem. So wolves are not back, cougars are not back, grizzlies were never there, I don't think. And then you mentioned elk. Are those the principal species that we wish were back in New England that aren't?
Yes, and the American marten has recovered in parts of its range, but not all of its range, which is another sort of mid-sized weasel that relies pretty heavily on those old forest structures and is missing. So that's a species that is here, but it's not abundant. It's more abundant in the Adirondack Park, where you have lots of big old forests, and there are occasionally in other parts of New England and then in northern Maine. Same with the lynx, the American or Canada lynx, I should say, is a sort of mid-sized wildcat. They still exist. They're endangered in Vermont. They are not in southern New England at all. And there are some in Maine, and I believe they're also endangered in New Hampshire and the Adirondack. So they still have healthy populations in Canada, but they could stand to recover a little more. And yeah, the wolves are making sort of some comeback, although it's a bit it's a challenging comeback because they're hybridizing with our eastern coyotes. And so we are sort of seeing wolf genetics coming back, and our coyotes are bigger and acting more like wolves, but it's not quite what, well, I guess there's some debate about whether it's the same sort of functional impact, ecological impacts of what wolves were in the past. Coyotes were not historically this far east. They were a plains canid, and they lived mostly in the west, and they kind of moved in the absence of wolves. And wolves were sort of the only thing in history that have effectively controlled coyote populations. Humans have tried desperately for many years, and all we seem to do is make more of them. So I sometimes think about it like when you're thinking about rewilding and you're a species like a wolf that is really struggling in, I guess, America broadly, if you're going to hitch your wagon to somebody, what better choice than coyotes to hybridize with? Because they really effectively manage themselves even under sort of fierce human persecution. So it's sort of an interesting adaptation, and I don't mean to say it was intentional or anything, but it's sort of interesting that wolves are hybridizing with the coyotes. I think it ends up making them sort of more resilient to modern pressures, but there is some debate about whether they fill the same ecological niches.
How far north do you have to go into Canada to find purebred wolves living in packs, living as wolves? And why aren't they spreading south? Because presumably in the eastern side of America, persecution is going to be less intense. That there seems to be a greater willingness to live with wildlife and a greater likelihood of kind of legal protection and so on than you might find in, say, the West or the Midwest. How do we get wolves back in the American Northeast?
Occasionally they are back. I mean, every once in a while, one is found, usually because it was shot and somebody thought it was a coyote, and then they'll do genetic testing. One was found in Cooperstown, New York, which is pretty far south of the Adirondack Park, a handful of years ago, and the genetics came back somewhere around 96% wolf DNA. So they are coming back occasionally, mostly probably dispersing young males. I think they occasionally get them in Maine today, but they're not really a functioning part of the ecosystem. I think there are functioning wolf herds in the Algonquin Provincial Park in Canada, which is not really far away. It's right across this corridor we call the A2A, the Algonquin to Adirondack corridor, where we're doing lots of land protection work to try to bolster the wildlife connectivity there to make it possible for things like wolves and cougars to come back. And interestingly, that same corridor is where probably, I think in like 2011, 2012, there was a male cougar hit in Connecticut that maybe you heard about. People call it the Connecticut cat. And it is believed to have walked in through the A2A corridor and down through the Adirondacks to get to New England. Again, a dispersing male looking for habitat and for mates. And if they don't find mates, they kind of keep going. And sadly, he walked across the entire country and did not find a mate. So yeah, there's less persecution in the East, but it still happens. And there's still agriculture, which is where a lot of that sort of comes from.
I mean, it's a perfect example of where rewilding makes sense to accelerate a recovery that would probably happen in due course, but it might take a hell of a long time. Mm-hmm. I really hope Mighty Earth and their coalition partners succeed in persuading the people of Vermont or perhaps Maine to conduct an actual reintroduction of mountain lions. And I hope wolves do make their own way back. Let's talk about the Northeast Wilderness Trust. The trust is about acquiring large blocks of land opportunistically using philanthropic funds. How do you do that? Where do you get the money from? Why do these big blocks come up? Like, what's the trust all about?
Yeah, so we're a sort of traditional land trust, which was a big movement in the United States, started maybe around a century ago, but really gained steam in the 80s. And it mostly was about farm and forest land protection, preventing sort of subdivision and the sort of fragmentation of forests and land. And in the early 2000s, a handful of sort of, I'll call them visionary people, realized that the missing piece of the puzzle was really wildlands, especially in the East. In the West, we still have big intact blocks of land, and we have a federal wilderness preservation system, but we don't have land blocks that are federally owned big enough to do those kind of protections in the East on the scale that we really felt was necessary. So Northeast Wilderness Trust was founded in 2002 to sort of fill that niche to protect land as wildlands using the traditional land trust model, which means we apply for grants or have relationships with private philanthropists, and we use that funding to just purchase land on the open market or work with landowners willing to donate. And we protect the land through conservation easements that are sort of legal protections, enduring legal protections that stay with the land that say it can't be developed or fragmented or whatever is listed in the easement.
And we're talking really big blocks of land. Like the most recent purchase, I don't know if it's gone through yet, is Magalan. What and where is that?
Magalloway.
Sorry, Magalloway.
That's in northwestern Maine. It's a big partnership with organizations, other land trusts, the Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust, the Forest Society of Maine, and the Nature Conservancy. And so the entire project is, well, I don't remember the total acreage, somewhere in the maybe 50, 70,000 acres. And then Northeast Wilderness Trust will be purchasing in fee and owning as a wilderness preserve about 11,000 acres sort of in the core of that. And so, yeah, that's our biggest single transaction. Mostly we end up buying parcels in the 1 to 5,000 acre range, and then we try to patch together bigger pieces over time. So we have a couple 7 to 10,000 acre preserves and a bunch in the 1 to 5. And we sort of, when we get something like that, it's sort of a nucleus, and then we build off of it as parcels around it come up on the open market. We try to buy those.
But it's not like buying, let's say, sheep ranches or dairy farms here in the UK, where you're creating a wholesale transformation of the landscape by rewilding it, because these areas are often already forest, right? You're presumably you're buying from logging operators, you're buying from people who are harvesting timber. So what kind of condition are these blocks of forest in when you're able to buy them?
Boy, they run the gamut. I mean, occasionally we take down barns and houses and structures and rewild the place where they were. But by and large, we are buying forestry property, and it has forests on it that have a long legacy of logging, and often the forests are fairly young, and then we allow them to passively rewild under our ownership. And then occasionally we come across one that's much older, and that's really exciting, but also much more expensive. The price per acre has a lot to do with how much standing timber is on a property on that market. So occasionally we find some properties with standing timber good and intact, and we're able to buy those. But by and large, it's properties that need some time to recover.
In this country, forestry is typically comprised of mono or dual species, single-age plantations, which are then clear-cut and replanted. And the species used are non-native species. So I'm looking out across the ridge right now at a plantation of forestry in the distance, and it's Sitka spruce from North America, it's Douglas fir, it might be western red cedar. They're all the same age. At some point, they will be cleared in one go. And so there's a huge opportunity there, either to transition to a more gentle form of forestry with continuous cover approaches and a kind of mix of ages and species and a bunch of native deciduous trees in among the commercial species, or to transition it completely to deciduous woodland. But the forestry that you're buying is typically made up of native species already.
Right.
So does that limit the scope for you to create kind of dramatic biodiversity uplift? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
Yeah, so the Northeast of the United States is, they sometimes call it like the wood basket. Our whole area wants to be trees. It is trees. It's hard to stop trees. And they come back in sort of a broad array of species, really expressing the bedrock and the soil conditions underneath. And so there is definitely some plantation logging here, but by and large, we have a much more sort of ecological form of forestry where they're mostly maintaining continuous cover or at least seed trees after a cut. So you're correct in that our passive rewilding approach is really more about just letting that forest accrue the structure and function of old forest over time. That's, I think, the critical niche we're filling is maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago, a report came out called the Wildlands Report that we were part of that was about New England. And it looked at all of New England and how much property was protected just to allow the forest to grow old. And it was, I think, about 3.7%, and that's it. And so most of our forests are cut fairly regularly, even if there is sort of intact forest canopy and adult trees. It's missing what it would have been in that sort of pre-colonial forest we were talking about, where it's these really mature, old, structurally complex and ecologically complex forests. You know, a lot of that biological legacy is removed over and over again by logging. So yes, the forest species composition is already there. And what we really need to do and what we're really trying to do with our work is bring back that more old forest condition. And the main ingredient for that is just time. That's what we're doing, is we're buying these forests time.
And also keeping out the developers, because that I think is one of the big threats to this extraordinary story in New England is just creeping development. America's terrible when it comes to planning. If you send a drone up in England and look down, you'll see quite a tight line around villages and towns because we have these green belts and we have zoning laws and planning and so on. And in America, the development seems much more uncontrolled. And presumably that is eating away at a lot of these forests. So your conservation easements, or even better, your direct ownership of these places really does protect them into perpetuity. And where are the really big wildernesses? You know, when you think kind of Yellowstone, you know, Yosemite, you think down in the southeast, Okefenokee, or further down the Everglades. Like in the northeast, I suppose the Adirondacks, established originally by the Rockefeller family. Where are the really big areas of wilderness that remain or could be pieced together?
The Adirondacks is definitely the big one in the Northeast, you know, millions of acres of wilderness in the Adirondacks. And that's it's a park, but it's a matrix of public and private land. And so much of the publicly owned land in the Adirondack Park is forever wild. And then there's Baxter State Park in Maine, which is a big state park with Katahdin Mountain, which is the terminus of the Appalachian Trail. That's a big wildland. And, you know, there's some wilderness areas in the Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forest. They're in the sort of medium-sized range, I'd say. And the White Mountains of New Hampshire also have some sort of medium-sized federal wilderness.
And then, of course, there's amazing potential for connecting these all up through initiatives like A2A, Adirondacks to Algonquin. And on the other side of America, Yellowstone to Yukon, the Y2Y initiative is doing some amazing stuff, connecting up these big blobs of nature with each other. Shelby, what do you love? You spent your life in the Northeast. Like, what do you love most about, personally speaking, about these forests? Like, where's your real happy place when you're out in nature in New England?
Oh, I mean, I love it all. I love to just go out and walk around off trail and get lost. We have so much forest in the Northeast, and it's not all wildlands, but it's all really special and lovely. And I think my favorite thing is to just get to know a place really well in every season, because it changes so much around the year from winter to summer. And I have special places that I go back to over and over, and I just sort of watch them go through the seasons. And I know the trees and the place and, everyone there. And I have these really wonderful experiences with them. I think building a very close relationship with place is sort of one of the major motivators of me in my work and my career. I've worked out west, and I spent a little bit of time in Africa and in the Virgin Islands. And now I'm back in the Northeast where I was born and raised. And this is sort of my home forest. And I love everything about it.
Yeah, I feel the same about my place in Somerset. I think Wendell Berry wrote that to be happy, you need to love your place, stay in your place as much as you can, and love your neighbours, which I always thought was very good advice. I'm not sure my neighbours loved me that much when I released a bunch of red deer, equivalent of elk in your landscape, a whole bunch of them. And I did so without the right fencing or any fencing. And it was a very, very good early lesson in rewilding that make sure you have the community on board before you start doing stuff. Although, as it happens, I am now friends with all my neighbours, and the red deer are still there, and they've spread all the way east up into Salisbury Plain and all the way west into the Somerset Levels, and it has kind of worked out. And there's a little bit of additional sport for those who like it. Shelby, where's the place of your childhood?
Right here, central Vermont. I was born here.
So Northeast Wilderness Trust is really a dream job for you.
It is, yeah. It's right in my home landscape, and I did wilderness work out in Wyoming, and I love Wyoming. It's a really beautiful space. There's lots and lots of public land, but it feels really different and really wonderfully rewarding to be doing it on sort of my home forests.
And if you could make one thing happen in that landscape, you are for a moment the empress of America, and you can wave a magic wand and make something happen in terms of ecological recovery in the land that you love most, what would it be?
Oh, that is a hard question. I think better planning. I think planning that takes nature into account. We talk at Northeast Wilderness Trust about having an ecocentric approach to what we do. We try to center the non-human lives out there when we're thinking about our conservation projects, when we're planning recreational access. Everything that we're doing for the other 99% of nature that doesn't have a voice in the human systems, generally speaking. And if I could wave a magic wand and make everyone think that way when they're planning cities and towns and development and corridors around here, if I could have everyone consider the perspectives of the non-human residents of the landscapes and weigh them equally with their own, that would be my dream.
I think that's a great answer, Shelby. And I'm just such a fan of what the Northeast Wilderness Trust is doing. I just keep coming back to this idea that buying land is and securing easements or securing long-term ownership is really the best way to create lasting impact. And I was with Chris Tompkins of Tompkins Conservation, and with her late husband Doug, they famously have protected in perpetuity more than 10 million acres in Patagonia. And really, she makes the point so well. You buy land and then you leverage it through partnership or working with the state to create national parks, secure easements and so on. And then it's done and you lock it away and that land is safe forever. And so the trust is just a deeply compelling prospect. And I was so excited to come across you guys. And I hope I have a chance to visit you in person at some point in the future. But in the meantime, Shelby, thank you so much for taking this time to chat to me. And good luck raising the rest of the money for what I keep calling Magaland, but it's not, is it?
Magalloway.
Magalloway. Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you so much, Ben, and come visit anytime.
My conversation with Shelby really makes me want to go to New England this autumn and see those incredible colours, the reds and the oranges and the yellows. Now, I don't know that part of the world very well, and it's an extraordinary wilderness, and it's getting wilder and better protected every year because of the work of the Northeast Wilderness Trust. Look up their work, and also please do give us a like or a share, a review on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. This Rewilding the World podcast series is growing so fast, and it makes me very happy to be getting these stories out there. Thank you. Next time, I'm going to be talking to teacher and one of my favourite authors, James Canton. James has brought out a book recently called Renaturing that describes how he has restored nature to a 2-acre plot behind his home in Essex. It's a great story and a guide for all of us of how we can restore nature or renature anything from a window box up to a large piece of land. I really look forward to that conversation.